I'll take you through some of the rest of the world at least. So let's turn to the USA, which, as Glenn pointed out, until recently was the largest emitter, but was overtaken by China in about 2006. So the long-term trends are very interesting here, and you can see that there are some turning points on the charts here, which tell some interesting stories. And what's particularly interesting is the turning point just before 2010 for both oil and coal. So oil and coal were increasing in the decades before that. Of course, we've got the oil crisis that Glenn mentioned in the 70s and early 80s. So there's increases over those decades since then. And then this turning point where both oil and coal decline, but they have different patterns after that. Oil appears to be mostly about the global financial crisis, which has changed the economic conditions and is a step change in the economy in the US, which has led to the changes in the way that they use oil. Whereas for coal, it's largely a story of the arrival of gas, natural gas from the shale boom. So this is hydraulic fracturing in the US. And that really took off in 2008, which coincidentally is about the time that the global financial crisis happened. So you can see the very steep decline in emissions from coal in the US since that time. There was a big drop in the global financial crisis in 2009, you can see that. But the general pathway downwards is largely driven by the arrival of natural gas. And the emissions from natural gas compensate for the lower emissions from coal. But because coal is a dirtier fuel, which means that you generate more CO2 emissions per unit of useful energy, the trade-off is in fact a good one. Of course, in the long term, we want to get both natural gas and coal down. So in looking at the more recent period, we can see very clearly in 2020 there the effect of the pandemic. And of course, as Glenn mentioned, most of the efforts by governments around the world to constrain the spread of the virus was about constraining our movement. And of course, the way that we move most of the time is powered by petroleum products from oil. So that the largest effect across the fuel categories was on oil there. And you can see also that in 2021 in the US that oil had recovered most of the ground it had lost. So emissions were about the same level as 2019, but still below, and have not yet recovered to the full level. So there's less transportation going on in the US. For coal, we can also see a large dip. And that's more because there was a drop in the demand for electricity in the US because of the pandemic, reduced economic activity, reduced activity of all sorts, and therefore reduced demand for coal. And it was natural gas that maintained its production. So coal at the time was more expensive. So when there was a drop in demand for power, it was coal that dropped out. Coal rebounded again in 2021, which again raised some eyebrows, but in fact it's still below the levels before the pandemic and has continued to decline on basically the same trend that we've seen for the last decade and a half. This graph shows forecasts for 2023 and 2024 made by the Energy Information Administration of the US. And they're forecasting lower coal emissions in 2023 than last year. All right, so the last point then on the US is this coal decline, which some people have termed a terminal decline. And you can see on this graph part of the boom in the construction of natural gas power plants, which ran from about 1999 to 2005. This is a very substantial increase in the number of power plants, the capacity of power plants, and particularly natural gas. And that actually happened before the shale gas boom. So there are a bunch of different reasons for that. But they were sitting there ready when the shale gas boom started. And so since then, because the price of natural gas in the US dropped sharply and became much more competitive with coal, and all sorts of continued additional regulations from, for example, the Environmental Protection Agency on air pollution and control of waste, coal-fired power stations have been retiring in very large numbers since the 2010. Of course, natural gas-fired power stations don't spit out sulfur and mercury, and they don't have coal ash, so it's much easier for them. All right, so turning to the EU. The EU combined countries are the third largest emitter of fossil CO2 in the world. Here again, looking at the long term, You can see some similar stories to the US, but also they're quite different. The rise in the emissions from oil, so the consumption of oil and therefore the emissions from oil through the 1960s is really quite phenomenal, from below half a gigaton to almost 2 gigatons. And then the complete change, of course, because of the energy crises, the oil crises, with events in the Middle East during that period. And that led to a huge new focus on energy efficiency that wasn't there before. We also see the decline in coal there. As Glenn mentioned before, the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So in the early 90s, a very sharp decline because of these very inefficient economies that then no longer had support and subsidies to drive these inefficient activities. But also the coal has declined over this period, and a large part of that is, again, these tighter and tighter regulations by the European Commission on air pollution and waste handling. It's had a lot to do with that decline there. And the emissions trading scheme, for most of its life, had a very low price on carbon. And it was in 2019 that the regulations changed and the price of carbon suddenly shot through the roof, and it became cheaper to produce power from natural gas than from coal. So turning to the recent term in Europe, we see the very large dip in oil, just the same as we saw in the US, but that persisted through until the early months of 2021. So there was still, in Germany, I remember there were in the first few months of 2021, there were very strong lockdowns. So a little bit longer dip in the EU than in the US. And what looks like almost a complete recovery of emissions and oil consumption, but not quite. But what's interesting there is the indications of the last few months that emissions from oil might be trending down in late 2022. And this could be a result, of course, of the way that the economy is going because of the energy crisis and inflation and so on. For natural gas, we can see that there is a steep decline in 2022. Obviously, there's been a very significant drop in the supply of natural gas to the EU, which has meant the prices have shot up to very high levels. And so consumption of natural gas is down over 10% in 2022 in the EU, and therefore emissions. Coal, we saw the large drop in 2019, which was, again, because of the changes in the emissions trading scheme. And then again in 2022 because of the pandemic. And again, that was because it was cheaper to produce power from natural gas. So when there was lower power demand during the pandemic, it was coal that dropped out. And then something of recovery in 2021 as the economy came back on track, as power demand increased again. And in particular, the rise in emissions from coal in early 2022 set some people to wonder whether the Green New Deal idea of Europe was put on the back burner. In fact, what we're seeing is that coal consumption is dropping again, and coal emissions therefore are dropping again. And in fact, there are expectations for a very large drop in the fossil share of power in 2023. So just lastly, a very interesting slide here showing the data from that Bruegel has collated from the transparency platform for European natural gas. And so you can see in 2021, the purple line there at the top, that supply of natural gas to the EU was dominated by this pipeline gas from Russia, which sustained some economies, very cheap energy for many years. And the sudden transition there in 2022, there's a decline already in 2021, geopolitics at play here. And then Russia supplying a very low share in early 2023 of natural gas into the EU. And on the flip side of that, the consequence of that is this rush to import a lot of LNG from other countries and LNG on ships. And this has sent the global price of LNG through the roof. All right, so turning to India, which is of the countries, the third largest emitter, fourth largest if we include the EU in there. Although they're just about crossed, I think, in fact. They're about the same. Okay, so from the long-term perspective, Glenn alluded to this, but up until independence in 1947 and the British colonial rule, economic growth in India for decades and decades was pretty much zero. It was a stagnant economy. So after independence, the next 3 decades or so, the economy grew at about 3.5% on average. So it started from an extremely low base. It was once one of the largest economies in the world several hundred years ago. It started at a very low base in the 1960s. And so it's really no surprise that it is starting to find its foot and to develop. So deregulation in particular in the 1990s really started to kick things off. And then through the 2000s, we see very large growth. Even in 2022, emissions in India are far below a half of the rest of the world's emissions per capita. So India is a country of 1.4 billion people. Indications are that it's just past China's population. China's population is decreasing, India is still increasing. We expect emissions in India to keep growing. There are lots of reasons for that. Development of the economy and of society is in large part about supply of energy, and energy supply is very low. So looking at recent years, we see a much noisier signal than we saw for the EU and the US. If we look at coal there, which is the dominant energy source in India because they have a lot of their own coal, they don't have a lot of natural gas, they import a lot of oil, which is bad for their balance sheets. They've got a lot of coal. It's a very noisy signal, and there's a couple of reasons for that. So one is that India has a monsoon. So all countries, their emissions are affected by weather, which affects the temperature and so on, and by policy changes. In India, these things are kind of amplified. The monsoon is a very large event every year, but how large it is also varies quite considerably from year to year. So the monsoon brings a lot of rain, which increases hydropower, which is good. That reduces the demand for coal. But the rain also creates very serious flooding. So, for example, 85% of coal mining in India is produced from open cast mines. A lot of those are flooded, which means they can't produce. A lot of other industries face flooding during monsoon, which means their economic activity is down. Transportation is more difficult because roads are flooded and rail is flooded. But how much this happens varies enormously from year to year, which leads to some of this volatility. And the other is the policy side, where we have in the current administration some policies that are introduced at short notice and have very profound effects on the economy, which drive very large changes in energy, sometimes drive them down. So looking at the effects that we can make out of the signal in 2020, we see a large drop across all 4 of those categories. Cement in particular, all cement factories were closed for several weeks during the first lockdown pandemic in 2020. So production went to zero. India had one of the strictest lockdowns in the world at the time, with the announcement made at 8 p.m. and valid from 12. It's 4 hours later. So it caused a lot of chaos. It caused a lot of economic pain. And over the 2 years, 2021 and 2020 and 2021, India's economy combined over that period grew only by 1%. So there is a lot of growth in 2021 to compensate for what happened in 2020 and additional growth in 2022. India's economy appears to be going very strongly again. So looking at power generation, we see the huge increase in the generation from coal in 2021 and 22. But we also see, which is I guess, a positive sign, the large increase from solar generation in 2022. Solar actually increased by 39% in 2022. Capacity was up by 25% over the year. But solar is still only 6% of total generation in India. So we do hear a lot about the renewables, but they're growing, of course, from a very small base, and there is a lot of coal. And a lot of those coal-fired power stations are underutilized, so there's a lot of capacity for them to burn more coal. I just wanted to point to one thing, which is that India had a target of 175 gigawatts of renewables by the end of 2022. They didn't achieve that. They achieved 119 gigawatts. Solar grew very well through 2022, reached just over 60 gigawatts. The target there was 100, so it's well short. Wind also fell well short of the target of 60 gigawatts. But there's a lot of scope for these to grow further. All right, I'll hand back to Glen.
Thank you. I'm back again just for a few minutes. So we've heard a lot about 2022 in the last two presentations. And in particular, there's a lot of uncertainty with what may happen in 2022. If we look at China, there's some conflicting data to come. And so 2022 still has some uncertainty, even though the year is finished, and we may update our statistics and growth rates for 2022. Now I'm going to talk to you about 2023, and we're only in February, still 10 months of the year to go, so huge uncertainties in what may happen in 2023. But it is still useful to look at some of the factors that are causing emissions to change in 2023, and therefore the way we may respond and so on. So I'm going to talk about two different types of projections here. The first one is focusing on the figure that I showed before of coal, oil and gas, but I've just made a projection for 2023 using some estimates from other organisations. So if we assume that coal remains stable, flat in 2023, this is based on the International Energy Agency coal market reports. Of course, there's a lot of uncertainty. Chinese coal, maybe it goes up, maybe it goes down, depending on decisions made throughout the year. But as a tentative projection, coal flat. In the US Energy Information Agency, in their short-term energy outlook, makes the projections for global oil production and consumption. So taking data from there, assuming oil grows about 1.1% in 2023, which takes it around about back to pre-pandemic levels. Again, back to the IEA, International Energy Agency, on their gas market reports, they expect this very slight growth in gas during 2023. And if we assume cement grows on trend, the same rate that it's grown in the last decade, putting all this together, we would find that fossil CO2 emissions globally would grow around about 0.5%, a small positive growth with big uncertainties. Independent way of looking at this is to look at economic activity. The International Monetary Fund in January had a projection of growth in economic activity globally, 2.9%. If we link that to the trend in efficiency and structural changes in the global economy, the CO2 per unit GDP, if we combine that with the growth in GDP, the economic activity, we get that emissions would go up around about 0.7%. So thankfully, these two sort of independent estimates give around about the same figure. So we would expect, based on what we know today, that fossil emissions may grow slightly in 2023, still not down, and still a lot of uncertainty. But that gives us some indication of where things may go. And with that, I'll hand over to Yen, and she will, I guess, give us a market perspective, mainly focusing on the EU and China and 2022 and 2023. Over to you.
Thanks, Glen. Hello, everyone. I'm Yen. I'm a market analyst at Refinitiv here in Oslo, in Norway. Yes, I actually work with emissions modeling quite extensively as well, forecasting emissions, same as the academic researchers here, although from a different perspective. And as me, I will focus more on the micro perspective. And yes, as to, what has affected emissions in Europe and China, or especially in Europe in 2022, was the energy market, a very volatile energy market. And this is the changes in energy prices will also have impact on emissions in 2023. And so this chart really shows the electricity as the dark line, and also the gas prices, the TTF gas prices, the dark green line. And we can see the development of the energy prices, that how volatile it was in 2022, but also how sort of they have come down now to the level in autumn 2021. So there is, we are seeing a slight relief now, probably at least for most of 2023 before the winter came again. But exactly because of the falling energy prices, major forecasters, they have revised up economic outlook for Europe and also for China, mainly because of the reopening. So yet a more brighter economic outlook for many regions in the world, which will have implications for energy demand and also the emissions. But again, so recovery is the theme in 2023, but the pace will determine a lot of things, energy prices, but also emissions. And yes, as a very good carbon analyst, I do have to mention the carbon price, as Robbie already touched upon. Yes, the carbon price, European carbon market, the price has went up since 2017 because of the reform, and it has driven coal to gas switching in the power sector and reducing power sector emissions. But in 2022, because of the skyrocketing gas prices, and that really makes the carbon price irrelevant or not fitting for its purpose last year. Very unfortunate. And the chart on the left that shows the profit margins for, theoretically, for coal power plants, that's in orange, and for gas power plants in blue. We can see that even despite actually coal prices has also went up with gas prices, but gas prices are so high and carbon prices average 81 euros last year per ton. And that is still unable to make gas plants running. So yet, as a result, in 2022, coal power generation in Europe has went up year on year. But as for this year, as shown in the previous slides, gas prices has came down, and so does coal price as well. But the drop in gas prices is much more significant. And European carbon price this week is approaching almost 100 euro levels. At this high, with the combination of a high carbon price and the drop in gas prices, it will make really we could see more gas plants running, or at least coal power generation is likely to fall year on year in Europe this year. So that will have implications for the power sector emissions. Although one caveat here is that Europe still has to ensure sufficient gas for the next winter. So in a way, is it economical to burn the gas, to burn more gas in power sector, or better save it for the winter? So we may see a clear picture as we entering the fourth quarter of this year. Yet just as in 2022, there are in addition to, or what's been driving the craziness in energy market is also weather. There is a drought across Europe. Here in Norway, we all feel that, and also temperatures. And we see that. So the chart on the right are European hydropower balances for many regions, and we can see that how dry it has been in 2022. So the curbed hydro output has partly contributed to the rebound in fossil generation last year. But this year, let's both wish and hope if hydropower output will recover to normal levels, and that will really limit fossil power generation in Europe. And yet, but on temperatures, well, it's actually we've seen, I think we can safely say that winter has been mild in continental Europe, and that's partly helped gas prices to decline. But in the summer months, what if we have much above normal temperatures, let's say heat waves, which will then drive up cooling demand and curb hydropower and even nuclear power output? So that will have implications on European power mix and emissions as well. So very important to watch out. So that's Europe. Yes, China. So what is going to happen in China is having huge implications, not only for energy markets, but also for global emissions. As Young Ivar's slide has already emphasized this, with China as reopening and rebound in economic and also transport activities, that will all boost energy demand from coal to gas to oil, etc. And power consumption is expected to grow. This 5 to 6% forecast is from China Electricity Council. So there is a catch-up game of how much can the renewables displace the increase in power demand, which requires more fossil power generation. Here I put up the capacity mix of China's power system in 2022. In 2022, installed capacity of renewables in China has overtaken that of coal. So 1120 gigawatts. So that's very significant. And this year, China's energy regulator has already set a target to add 160 gigawatts of wind and solar capacity. And yes, also again, similar to Europe, maybe we'll see a bit recovery in hydro output as well. So all this, meaning renewables will continue, maybe not fully replace, but squeeze the fossil power plants running hours. So I think that's very, let's say, a downside for emissions, but very positive for the climate. Well, yet recovery, this is my last slide. Actually, I'm ending with a question mark just to highlight the uncertainties. Yet, I mean, China's reopening is mentioned across all sectors as affecting economy and global energy demand or global energy prices. Yet I think, most economists would expect China to set a growth target, GDP growth target of 5% this year. Or I mean, IMF put a 5.2% growth, so very strong rebound, following the 3% growth last year. But recently, we also see there's some cautiousness, both raised by researchers and also indicated by latest data. Yes, I mean, that's a very interesting article in CICERO, which posts this chart, and they pointed out a few factors could really change the trajectory of China's recovery. How fast and how much? So one is consumer spending after the lifting of COVID restrictions, etc. And second is real estate rebound. As I myself, I follow the real estate sector very closely. My younger brother, he's a real estate developer in my hometown. So he sent me this picture on 14th of February. That's a residential building his company has built after so many delays because they were unable to get cement, get steel during the lockdown, but they finally finished it and actually sold very well. So yes, so that's both good for our family, but in a way, that's a sign of a big recovery in the real estate sector. But we also see the dip as to how much it can rebound. I also heard so many stories from him. I mean, the high debt levels. And also, I mean, unemployment is still quite high. Let's see if that's the way, if consumer spending could rebound more fast to get employment up, then people's, like say, purchasing power would recover. So that will facilitate. But it is very uncertain. I mean, to ensure economic growth is at the forefront of Chinese policymaking this year and probably over the next couple of years. But as to how much the growth could materialize, there is a big question mark. And also ending on the point that China will maintain its export-driven growth. So what is happening outside of China, or how much recovery we can see in Europe, we also determine how fast China's industrial activities can rebound. So yes, a lot to watch out for, and happy to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Then we will restructure ourselves to have a discussion